Live in England in a small town with about 1,000 people there. We are located in the deep countryside and crime just doesn't happen often apart from the odd stolen bike etc. I suppose we are quite relaxed about home security and will often leave the door open all day in summer for the dog to walk in now to see pleases leaving the cars unlocked. And even the house sometimes never with any problems, maybe are naive and this played a part in the story. It's important to note that my kitchen backs into a public footpath which in summer is extremely busy with people walking their dogs. They can look straight in the many windows from the footpaths into our kitchen. With the setting explained, I'll get on with the story. I was about 16 at the time. The story was a couple of years ago. I had taken my dog out for a walk mid-afternoon like I did every day. I grabbed his lead and locked the door and took him out for an hour walk through the fields that surrounded my house, and then came back. When I came back, opened the door and placed the keys in the kitchen table and went on with my day. Later on, my mother asked if I had seen the kitchen door key, and I explained that I had left it on the table. She went and looked and wasn't there, and then doubted myself, thinking maybe I didn't lock the door when I left and I dropped it on the walk. Although I was certain I could remember leaving it on the table. I didn't think much about it, thinking it would reappear in the house. If it didn't, I would find it on the walk the next day, as I always walk the same route. The couple of days went by and the key still wasn't found. I searched the house in my walk route, but it couldn't be found. I found it rather strange as I recall putting it on the table, but I assumed I had imagined it and I must have dropped it. Luckily, we had another key and went on using that key for the door instead. About 4 days after losing my keys, which didn't just have the kitchen door key but also had the front door key on, myself and my mom were disrupted from watching the TV by our dog barking like crazy in the kitchen. This is very out of character for him as he normally barks in the day when people walk past the kitchen. Me and my mom went in to find out what had upset him to find the new kid fallen out the door and so on the floor. This was extremely strange, because we have extremely old doors since my house is about 200 years old. The keys are very thick, old-fashioned keys. And the only way that they can fall out of the door is if you push a key in from the other side, or that you pull it out. Me and my mom were a little concerned at this point, but decided we were being silly, so we locked and bolted the door and went to bed. When I got to my room, I locked my bedroom door as I quite often do to stop my parents disrupted me in the morning. Thank God I did this night as well. And the next morning, I was awoken by my father shouting he was leaving for work and he would lock the door. My mom had already left, so it was just me, and I heard him lock the door, and I tried to go back to sleep. Roughly 10 minutes later, the door being locked and opened again, and someone comes straight upstairs. I thought nothing of this, and assumed my dad had forgotten something. That was still the person walked straight upstairs to my bedroom door, and started rattling it forcefully, trying to get it open. I was confused, and shouted, "Hello." At this moment, I heard someone spring from my room and down the stairs, nearly shaking the house. He ran that fast. I knew it wasn't my dad now. I jumped out of bed and locked my door and ran downstairs to make sure my dog was okay. When I got to the stairs, I could see the front door was wide open. I panicked and ran outside to see if I could see anyone, but I couldn't. At this point, I started to cry when it finally occurred to me that someone must have seen my keys on the kitchen table, taken them and tried to get into my house the night before, but was disturbed by my dark. It didn't make sense to me though, because right next to our front door was my MacBook 50-inch TV, a mobile phone all in arm's reach, but the person didn't stop at all. They just walked straight up to my room with purpose. I filmed my brother, who came storming round trying to condole me. He decided he would take me out to get some food after calming me down as much as he could. When we were about to leave, we made sure all doors downstairs were locked and bolted except the front door, which cannot be bolted. My brother also went upstairs and shut every single door of the room upstairs. We went up and came back to the front door again unlocked. At this point, I was so scared if once hadn't been enough. We went inside to see again. Nothing was stolen. Everything was in its place apart from the laptop and mobile, which we had moved beforehand. We went upstairs to check if anything was gone upstairs to find when we went upstairs. Only one door was open. Which was, you guessed it, my bedroom. Nothing I could notice was stolen. And you could tell someone had looked around, but I couldn't see anything missing. My parents assumed that I must have had a stalker, which I couldn't pinpoint anyone who could likely be being a teenager with red hair. My hair and looks have always given me, and still to this day, get me unwanted attention of many creepy man, which I will put this encounter down to. We'll change the locks and all doors and added extra bolts. We've never had any issues since, but I'm still terrified to be home alone. It terrifies me to think what the person's intentions were and how persistent he was breaking in. I'm so glad I had locked my bedroom door that day. And the intruder wasn't able to barge in. When I was 14, I met a guy named James. He was 17. I dated him for 5 years and 30. Now I grew up very poor to a teenage mother, never met my father till I was 20. I made some pretty bad choices as a young lady. James was a big-time dealer. At the time I found that thrilling and so cool. It was a typical abusive relationship. He cheated on me a lot, would physically, mentally, and emotionally abused me. He would then buy me things, or give me money to make it all better. Unfortunately, at the time, I didn't know any better and how to poor self-esteem. His money took me away from my poor home life. So I stayed for 5 years. This happened when I was 17. James and his brother Victor bought a house in a really nice neighborhood. Victor was a single guy, the player type. He had a random girl over visiting that night. James and I were going to bed. It was about midnight. Victor and his new girlfriend left the house and took James's vehicle. James and I were alone in the house. About 2 minutes after Victor left, we heard a knock at the door. James gets up and says, "Oh, I must have forgotten his keys. I'll be right back." I'm in bed. I hear James say, "Oh, you have the wrong house, man, buzz off." He comes running into the room, telling me to close the door. As we hear the door getting kicked down, 2 men entered the house. One was wearing a bandana over his face. The other guy didn't recognize he wasn't trying to hide his identity. They started kicking down the bedroom door. We did our best to hold our weight against it. We were screaming and begging them to leave. At one point the bandana guy got his arm and leg through the door, and I made eye contact with him. He dropped a sawed-off shotgun. I reached for it and he seemed to back off a little bit. The other guy grabbed the gun out of fear. I couldn't recognize him. But I felt something in the stare he gave me. We thought maybe they were after money or some sort of contraband. We had no weapons, and all of the illicit stuff was in a separate bedroom. That didn't take anything. There wasn't a robbery. They were there to give someone a beating. James was on the phone with the police. The whole time this was happening. The guys took off. It was time to check what they took and hide all of our stuff. The police came. They noticed a bullet hole in the wall in the bedroom, directly beside the room we were in. I found out later it was because bandana guy hit the gun out of the other guy's hand as he tried to shoot me through the door. I went home the next day, completely traumatized, not wanting to tell my family anything that happened. They all gossip. I walked in the door and my grandmother knew about the home invasion. My family knew James was a dealer and they weren't concerned. I thought at the time someone who James knew must have known someone in my family, since she said a female cousin told her my cousin Nathan, his wife, called me saying Anthony wants to say sorry, but you weren't supposed to be there. Again, I was dumb and assumed someone the thug world told them. We lived in a small city, and was so naive and was convinced it was a robbery from another rival dealer. That wasn't the case at all. We spent weeks waiting for them to come back. Jeans made sure he had always had a few scary guys with guns in the house. I realized now that this only adds to my trauma. A few months after this happens, I'm at James's house reading the newspaper. I see my cousin Anthony and another guy in the most wanted section. The other guy looked vaguely familiar. Anthony is gang-related. We're the same age and grew up extremely close. Although he got locked up at age 13 and has been on and off ever since. Anthony and I would write to each other. We have a strong bond and the phone rings. It's a girl named Carly that is completely in love with Victor, but since he's a player, he treats her like crap. She brings up the mug shots in the paper and says that your cousin, right? She confesses to me that the home invasion was because of her. The other guy in the mug shot liked her and told him how Victor would slap her around. My cousin Anthony was his friend. They made her tell them where Victor lived. And they watched the house until they had seen what they thought was me and James leaving. She was apologizing profusely, begging me not to tell James I didn't. I knew if I told him he would have had her shot, and also because it was my cousin. I assumed that would get some blame or have to show James thugs where my cousin lived. Regardless of what he did, stupidly loyal to family. I saw Anthony at a family function a few years later. He said sorry, and then he loves me that it wasn't his fault. I was 13 years ago. My life is completely different now. I consider myself an upstanding member of society. But I still feel a lump in my throat when I talk about it. I can't even go to a gun range without having an all-out panic attack. Live in the UK, just an ordinary British suburb. Nothing exciting happens, nor anything overly dangerous. Over the years I've heard stories of how a house a few streets south of my house is owned by a small company, if you can call it that helps mental patients deemed not dangerous. Oh, cool, right? I think nothing of it. On a regular midweek day, an old retired lady is home alone while their husband works. She lives in the corner of my dead-end road, directly next to an alleyway in a creepy little area hidden between houses. Anyway, the story goes to this guy, who apparently was mentally unstable, who belongs to that home, came out alone from the alleyway and proceeds to this old lady's back gate. Luckily for her, as he passes down the side of the house, she sees a figure move quickly past a window in the corner of her eye. She moves through the house in the direction of the movement. As they're both moving in the same direction, they both end up in plain view of each other, separated by only a glass patio and sliding door. He reaches for the door handle, and fortunately for the old lady, it's locked. After an immediate struggle to get the door open, he pulls out a pair of scissors and attempts to hack the windows and door open. This fails. Thank God for double-glazed windows. As this is happening, this lady, who I resume has absolutely terrified, calls the police as you would. He feels it getting inside the house and begins to get the clothes from the washing line in her garden and cuts up all her and her husband's clothes. He left and got away before the police turned up and simply left her mortified. After this, I noticed CCTV cameras go up in that area. And this is how it could affect me. This got me thinking. As a kid, I was always haunted of the idea of home invasion. Strangers coming into my house, taking me, robbing me, hurting me, etc. But as I grew up, I grew out of that fear and wasn't really bothered. I lived in a relatively safe area, so I kind of never had my guard up. Over the summers, my dad gets home from working nights at about 8-9 a.m. and leaves my downstairs patio and sliding doors open leading to the back garden. So my dog could go in and out of the garden as she pleased, as it's summer and it's hot. Because my dad thought keeping her indoors would be, meanwhile, he came home and slept for a few hours in the day. To this point, as my dad would return home and feed my pet and open the doors and go to sleep, I would be asleep, not having woken up yet, being a typical lazy teen. So after this creepy story of the weird man and the old lady, it was brought to my attention that it could have easily been us. A guy willing to creep through the back gate and enter my house with a clearly open and unlocked back door. At the right time. I could have been fast asleep and had the bus stop at a bed and defend myself, or not. Something crazy could have happened, as of course he was wielding a weapon and still out of habit and forgetfulness. I resume leaving the back door open in the middle of the day. As for the guy, he's still out there, and it very much could be my house. He visits next. So I was living in Venice, California about a year ago. I lived in a 4-bedroom apartment with 3 other ladies, all of us in our mid to late 20s. The apartment setup is pretty complicated. Our apartment is a standalone building, and there are 2 other standalone apartments in front of our side by side. This forms a pretty private courtyard for our apartment, not accessible to the neighbors. My bedroom and my roommate Jesse's bedroom both have a large sliding glass door that opens onto the courtyard, and the front door of the apartment is accessed from the courtyard as well. In order to get into the courtyard, you have to open the spike-top lock gate, walk down a pathway between the 2 apartments in front of us and open the locked door to the courtyard. The courtyard is enclosed by 12-foot cinderblock walls, and on the other side is the neighbor's gated narrow side yard and alleyway, and a few side yards between that. So basically, the building is completely blocked in and very hard to access and requires 3 different keys to gain access to the actual apartment. This isn't a great neighborhood, but we felt pretty safe and we moved in about 2 months after we move in. It's 6 a.m. on a Sunday, and we're all home and in our rooms asleep. Jesse's boyfriend is asleep in bed with her, and I have a new guy up for the first time as well. He has a 60-pound dog, and she leaves her sliding door partially open at night for the dog to go in and out. Keep in mind we're inside 12-foot walls and are completely enclosed by other houses and apartment buildings. So those walls themselves aren't even accessible by anyone but our immediate neighbors. So leaving this door open does not seem risky at all. I mean seriously, someone would have to be incredibly dedicated and have intimate knowledge of the layout of the place to pull off any sort of successful robbery, so leaving the door open felt safe. So at 6 a.m. and Jesse's dog starts barking. She opens her eyes, just in time to see through her sheer curtain the silhouette of a man drop inside the courtyard from the 12-foot wall. The dog bursts out of the door barking, and for some reason, the guy shushes the dog, pushing him back inside and slides the door shut. Then he goes to the front door between Jesse's bedroom and mine and starts knocking. I'm about 50% awake at this point, and it slowly dawned on me that if someone is knocking on that door, they must have somehow bypassed the other 2 locked doors and something is not right. Jessie is also about 50% awake, which causes her to assume that this is a person we know. So she opens the door for him. Note this girl is literally a rocket scientist. She's not dumb, save your judgment. He pushes open the door and forces his way inside. She fully wakes up real fast and says nope. I don't know you, and shoves him back out, locking the door. He goes back to our sliding door, which he knows is unlocked, and walks in just his boyfriend Mike, and nothing but his whitey-tighties flies out of bed and shoves him back out into the courtyard. Jessie runs in and shuts the slide-in door, locking it by the really advanced method of laying a long piece of wood in the track because our insane landlady won't install real locks. The piece of wood isn't quite long enough, so the door can still be opened about 2 inches. So after securing the door as best as possible, she burst into my bedroom, at which point I fully awaken. I'm naked in bed with an equally naked dude. She runs to my sliding door and locks it. This one actually works. And when she pulls back the curtain, I see Mike in the courtyard in a very physical fight with a guy I definitely do not know. Mike is a super non-violent data scientist nerdy type, for the record. And he is fighting with a not very big, but still bigger than Mike, angry-looking dude. Mike is on the ground getting his face pummeled into the flagstone, and the dog is running around barking, but otherwise being pretty unhelpful. Mike is trying to reason with the guy the whole time, saying, "Hey, we don't want any of this, you can just leave, it'll be fine." And the guy stops just long enough for Mike to grab his arms, push him off and jump up. Mike says, "Hey, here's the door, just leave," and opens the door that leads from the courtyard out to the pathway towards the gate. The guy somehow manages to shove both Mike and the dog out that door and locks it behind them. So now the guy has barricaded himself in our courtyard, Mike and dog on one side, my now mostly closed self. 3 other terrified girls and 1 now mostly closed guy still inside the apartment. There is one other way out of this apartment, and that is through the garage. Except it turns out our landlady is pretty incompetent with locks in general. So the garage door is brilliantly set up such that the lock is only accessible from the outside. Yeah, we're completely trapped inside this building. And the guy is working on Jesse's sliding door again. My other roommate Emily, whose room is upstairs but facing the courtyard, has been on the phone with 911 the whole time. She's explaining the situation as best she can. And the 911 operator is telling her that since the guy is technically only in our yard, it's not a priority and we can't really do anything. He needs to be in the house to consider it an emergency. So the guy who was formerly naked takes the phone and fairly calmly says something to the effect of this man has bypassed 2 locked doors and scaled a 12-foot wall to access the location he is currently occupying. He has forced his way into the house twice. He assaulted one person and has locked the assaulted out. He is currently attempting to access the house again through a door which has no lock and whose glass is thin enough to break. If you were to ask nicely enough, we have no weapons and no way out. You need to get here as soon as possible. Fortunately, the police were already on the way because the neighbor had called them about a raving lunatic and whitey-tidies. It was running around the street yelling for someone to call 911. And apparently now for some reason wielding a hockey stick. As we're watching the guy's best weekend from the upstairs window, his behavior starts to change. He stops trying to open the door and begins pacing. He peeks around things. He looks behind him. It becomes apparent he's been running from something and is now bracing himself in case they catch up. Cops, violent gangs, with guns. We honestly have no idea, and that's actually super scary. At one point he disappears from the window's view. So I run up to the roof deck to see what he's doing has appeared down. I'm startled to realize he's a lot closer to me than I expected because he's climbing a tree that shoots straight up to the roof deck. Note: I later tried climbing that same tree. And seriously, the dude must have had superpowers. Totally sure of it. But then he decides he won't go all the way up. He'll just drop onto the roof of the little shed type thing that houses the hot water heater. He lays on his stomach and appears around the corner and sits back on his knees pulled up and starts kind of rocking. It's suddenly super obvious that this guy is out of his mind. This is later confirmed by Mike, who eventually retires his hockey stick and thankfully puts some pants, informing us that when he tried to offer the guy an exit through the open door, the guy replied, "No, there's danger behind that door." And that's when he shoved him and the dog out and presumably sacrificed them to whatever horrors laying in wait on the other side. After a short time of watching him switching between paranoid peeking and paranoid rocking, the cops finally show up. They calmly convinced him to just come down and they peacefully cuff him. No, really, it was actually pretty chill. But cops basically said they thought he was on something or multiple things, but probably mostly PCP. He had apparently been living with his art in a nearby apartment complex and must have been just as confused about how he got into our place as we were. From our rooftop deck, you could see where he had broken a wooden fence to get from a side yard into the neighbor's alley. You could also see the tiered wooden plant stand the neighbor had propped against the wall that the guy had scaled to get into our courtyard. And they eventually charged him with a few counts of assault, but couldn't charge him for trespassing because we didn't have any no trespassing signs. The story takes place in Monterrey, Mexico, when I was about 10 years old. If you don't know, Monterrey is actually a pretty crime-infested city. It's beautiful. You just got to know and what spots you are in. All throughout my childhood, I would visit and live in Mexico during the summers. So I can be around my family that still lives there to this day. Although the summer of 2009 was the last summer my family would be going there for obvious reasons I'm about to present. So all of my family from a mom's and dad's side all live in the city called Monterrey, and Mexico. I'm pretty sure much of you probably don't know the place. But let's just say it's not the most safe city to be in, especially with the current situation Mexico has with narcos and crime. Me and my two brothers, however, never saw it this way. and instead thought more of our cousins and family. We lived in a 2-story house in the regular neighborhood. Nothing fancy or expensive, just normal, I guess. There had always been problems with corrupt police and robberies throughout the night, but I never expected to be a victim of it. One particular night, me and my 2 brothers saw between the ages of 8 and 12 were home alone with just my mom since my dad had gone out to go drinking with my uncles. Before the sunset, my mom was already a nervous wreck after supposedly seeing the same white Toyota passed by our house more than a couple of times. My mom took this very seriously due to the fact that her side of the family had fallen victim to break-in similar to what was happening. However, she did not want to scare us and just told us that today we had to be going to sleep earlier than usual. My father didn't own a phone and still doesn't, mostly because he's an old traditional type of guy. So my mom couldn't just call him to come home. I was confused as me and my brother Louis looked at each other with a disappointed reaction, as we wanted to stay up later in the living room and play some Call of Duty. But my mom wasn't having it and demanded we go to our room early. My oldest brother Mario was soon catching up to the events and even looked a little worried now that I remember. We all slept in the same room that night, but we couldn't get any sleep. Midnight rolled around me, and my brothers were joking around when suddenly we heard a small creak coming from downstairs. The sound was usually made when the back door was open. Since the house was mostly empty and pretty old, you could basically hear anything at a time like night when the house was quiet. Frozen, my brothers and I stayed quiet. "Is that dead?" Mario asked. But I knew this was not possible since my dad always comes home around morning time since he doesn't drink and drive. "What if it's those guys from afternoon?" Louis said in a jokingly voice. Although I gotta admit, my heart dropped at the sound of that. We all stayed quiet to try and hear any noise when all of a sudden, we could hear whispers coming from downstairs. We froze in shock as we knew that this was not any of our family members. The more and more we listened, I couldn't make up the voices about 2 or 3 people down there. I had never really felt adrenaline before in my life, but I could feel it with every pump from my heart gave. I started thinking of the worst of those kids that got kidnapped and never returned stories. Then with a shocking decision, my oldest brother said that he would take a peek. "Are you crazy?" I said, wanting to shout, but obviously couldn't chill out. "Is probably just mom with her uncles or something." He replied. For about 20 seconds, which seemed like minutes at the time, he returned to add to our horror. He returned pale and was shaking so much I had to tell him to calm down. When he finally spoke, his voice was stutter. He remembered the words. "Get ice there, someone's down there." My stomach twisted with those words, and I could feel my heart pumping faster than ever. Before we could react, I heard the most bone-chilling scream I had never heard. The scream was so horrific at first I didn't even recognize it was my mother's. In the span of seconds, my mom ran through the hallway into a room and locked the door. I could hear so many footsteps coming up the stairs and rapid movement. I was in shock as I realized what was happening. My brother Louis was crying frantically next to me. My mom threw us in the corner of the room farthest from the door and began trying to open the window. The men were pounding hard at the door. But I mean, how hard? I honestly thought that in that moment, we were all going to die or get kidnapped. I burst into tears as I saw my mom screaming out at the top of her lungs out the window, calling for help. Never had I heard the sound of despair coming from my mom's voice. From what little I could understand, the men were shouting in Spanish to shut up, and things along the lines of break the store down. I must have had a panic attack, because all I remember was waking up to the sounds of sirens coming from the end of the block. I could hear the men's footsteps running down the stairs, not the back door. Turns out our neighbor, God bless her, had seen the group of thugs since the beginning and alerted the cops as soon as they heard them in our backyard. The police searched everyone, even went on to the next 2 streets. But as we all know, they belong gone for a long time after I had nightmares, and would have panic attacks when I would hear small voices at night. But as the years went on, so did my fear. My mom has never wanted to go back. And if we ever did, it would be in a hotel. She always says my dad tried to sell the property. But when my uncle went to go check the place out, it had already been broken in and some stuff was missing. Nothing valuable, but just gives me more reason for never wanting to go back. Mexico can be a fun place. But please, please do be careful. Sometimes the police officers won't help. So in some situations, you're all alone.